Hi, my name is David Hicks. Welcome to another edition of How to Come Up with the Longest Titles That You Possibly Can. Okay, anyway, it's another video in this series on the Sermon on the Mount. Thank you for tuning in. For those of you who just jumped in on this video, you haven't seen any others in the series. The Sermon on the Mount is a set of Jesus' teachings where he did on a mountainside, on a hillside. He's teaching his followers. There are some very similar teachings in Luke chapter 6, where Jesus is on a flat place, and we call that the Sermon on the Plain. Sometimes we look at that, but that won't be in today's lesson. But today, in this portion of the Sermon on the Mount, we focus on Jesus' teachings about the eye and its power, how it affects our whole body. And we also look at Jesus' warning about trying to serve two masters. So, without further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Matthew chapter 6, verse 22 through 23, Jesus talks about how the eye is the lamp of the body. All right, here we go. Jesus speaking. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Now, Jesus repeats this teaching, or Luke also writes about this teaching in another section in Luke chapter 11, verse 33 through 36. And let's go ahead and read that, and then we'll talk about what Jesus said here. Luke chapter 11, verse 33 36. No one lights a lamp and puts it in a place where it will be hidden or under a bowl. Instead, he puts it on its stand so that those who come in may see the light. Now, this is actually another part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus talks about, we're the light of the world. Let our light so shine before others that they may see our good works and glorify our Father who's in heaven. We were created to be hidden. God wants people to be able to see our acts of kindness, goodness, patience, love, perseverance, self-control, and glorify Him and turn to Him because they see Jesus being real in our lives. So that is kind of a hint, an indication here that as Jesus continues to talk about light and darkness, as we'll see later on, this isn't about literal light and literal darkness. It's more about good and evil, right and wrong. But let's look at what he says. Verse 34, your eye is the lamp of the body, of your body. When your eyes are good, your whole body also is full of light. But when they are bad, your body also is full of darkness. See to it then, that the light within you is not darkness. Therefore, if your whole body is full of light and no part of it dark, it will be completely lighted, as when the light of a lamp shines on you. All right, so we've got a choice here. We can let our eye be good, or we can let our eye be bad. And what does that mean? How does it affect us? Well, when we let in light, it affects our whole body in a good way. But when our eye isn't shining, when we're letting in darkness, it fills our body with darkness. Now, light and darkness, as I tried to allude to earlier, is often a comparison, a metaphor for good versus evil, God's ways versus Satan's ways, light versus darkness. Right versus wrong. 1 John chapter 2, verse 9 through 11 is an example of this. John the Apostle, one of Jesus' best friends, he wrote the Gospel of John, which is all about the life of Jesus, and then he wrote 3 tiny letters that are also in the Bible. The 3 tiny letters are 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. So in that first letter, chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, John is going to use light and darkness as an analogy to good and evil. 1 John 2, 9 through 11. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates his brother is still in the darkness. Whoever loves his brother lives in the light, and there is nothing in him to make him stumble. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. He does not know where he's going because the darkness has blinded him. So, if we say we are in the light, we're walking with God, we're following Jesus, but we hate our brother, we're still in darkness. We're in darkness. But when we love others as Jesus loved us, then we are truly in the light. We are truly following God. We're truly following Jesus. And so, yes, I want you to see that sometimes light and darkness is used to represent good and evil, but the most important thing here, the biggest takeaway, is not to hate our brother. Okay? But let's love one another. Let's love one another. All right. So going back to what Jesus was saying then, when our eyes are looking at things that are good and holy and pure, that's going to fill our minds, it's going to fill our hearts, it's going to fill our bodies, in a manner of speaking, with goodness and purity and wholeness. But when our eyes are taking in darkness, then that's going to fill our minds with darkness. It's going to fill our heart with darkness, with evil. And it's going to have a negative effect on our entire body. So another way to look at this is how Paul wrote about it in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 through 10. He uses a different analogy, but I think it helps us understand what Jesus was saying about the power of the eye. Okay? Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 through 10. Paul writes, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." What you put into the ground, that's the kind of plant that you're going to reap. "The one who sows to please his sinful nature, from that nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." So, don't kid yourself, okay? What you feed your body's going to react to it. We know that with physical food, junk food versus healthy food, for example, overeating versus eating properly. Our body has positive and negative reactions to what we eat. It's the same way with our soul, our mind, our heart. If we are, for example, you're watching this video now, hopefully this is a very helpful, enlightening video that is feeding your spirit, it's feeding your mind, it's filling you full of light even as we speak. But when we watch darker things and set those before our eyes, when we listen to, see, another way we sow into our body, into our minds, into our spirit are the things that we listen to. When we listen to darkness, we're going to reap darkness. Now, the best example I can think of this, came to me last night, because I'd heard about this before, and so I did a little tiny bit of research on it and found it. Serial killer Ted Bundy. When I looked him up, he was described this way as a serial killer. Hey, son. Yeah. I am pausing the video for my son's sake. We are now continuing our video after the little interruption from family. I hope you don't mind. Okay, so serial killer Ted Bundy, described this way, rapist, kidnapper, murderer, confessed to killing at least 30 women. There were probably more. We don't know the actual number. And so he described the effect that pornography had on his life. So if you look up on YouTube, serial killer Ted Bundy, that's probably all you need to do and pornography, and it'll probably pop up this whole video for you. You don't need to type in every word here, but this was the title of it. See, we are talking about how to come up with the longest titles you possibly can today. But in that video, he describes the effect that pornography had on his life, beginning with quote-unquote soft pornography and going on to hardcore pornography that included violence. And so he kept sowing this darkness into his body, images of porn, images of violence, and in the end, he chose to act on those images and make them reality. Killed at least 30 women. Kidnapper, rapist. He sowed darkness into his body, and he reaped darkness. His eye was bad, and so his whole body became full of darkness. So we have to be careful about what we choose to watch. We have to be careful about what we choose to listen to. I mean, you can't, for example, listen to songs about sex, watch TV stories about sex, movies about sex, read books about sex, and then reap self-control. When you're alone with that person to whom you're attracted, you're not going to be able to reap self-control and say no, because you've been feeding the very opposite into your body. So we have to be careful about what we put in our, what we look at, what we listen to, because those are very powerful influences on our minds and on our hearts. Now, the Pharisees, who were one of the people that crucified Jesus, or were instrumental, a group of people that were instrumental in getting Jesus crucified. They were, as Paul described it, the strictest sect of Judaism. They would take a teaching like this and come up with a whole bunch of laws, rules, and regulations about what you exactly can look at and what you exactly can't look at. That's not the way God's teachings work. Okay? That's not what God wants us to do with his teachings. We have to take it with our understanding. We have to and apply it to our lives. And I may draw lines in places you won't. You may draw lines in places I won't. But the heart behind what we both need to be doing is, I want to keep my eye good. I want to be careful about what I set before it. Be careful with images of darkness. All right. So let's go into the second teaching that Jesus had here. Matthew chapter 6, beginning and ending with verse 24. He says somewhere, here we go. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. All right, so we've got two different kinds of masters here. We've got God and money. Now, a lot of translations, older translations, use the word mammon here, M-A-M-M-O-N. And that's a term that refers to riches, wealth, money. Okay, so Jesus is saying that you can't serve, you can't serve two masters. You want to love one and hate the other. And he specifically applies this to the example of God versus money, God versus wealth and riches. There's a similar teaching, again, in the book of Luke, chapter 16, verse 13 through 15. And one thing to remember is Jesus repeated his teachings quite often. He was going around from village to village. He was going on basically a preaching circuit from synagogue to synagogue, or wherever he could find places to preach and teach. So he would have repeated his teachings often. So it's not surprising that he would say, he would talk about the eye being the lamp of the body in one context, and in another context repeat that teaching whenever he felt it appropriate. So Luke chapter 16, okay, let me scoot back a little bit so you can see the board better. Luke chapter 16, verse 13 through 15. No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, I mentioned earlier by God's providence, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. What is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight." That's a scary thought. All right, but let's look at it as a whole. Again, he says no one can serve two masters. You're going to love one, hate the other. You're going to be loyal to one, despise the other. And he specifically applies it to God and money. And unfortunately, again, in other translations, I'm pretty sure here it reads mammon. So we're talking about wealth, riches, that kind of thing. So the Pharisees, as I mentioned before, very strict sect of the Jews, had lots of very nitpicky laws and traditions that they really adhered to while ignoring the major stuff: love, justice, mercy, faith, the big things. They sneered at Jesus. They mocked Jesus. They hated what Jesus was saying here because they loved money. And they thought Jesus was basically off his rocker. So he tells them, you justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God knows your hearts. God knows our hearts. And the great thing, that can be good, that can be bad, depending on what condition our heart is in. Really, I would say it's always a good thing in this sense, because even when our heart is bad, God can see that, and he says, okay, this is what I need to do to change that heart, if you're willing to let your heart be changed. And that's what you've got to look at yourself and ask that. Am I willing to let God mold and make my heart into a better heart? Am I willing to let him mold and make me into a better person, more loving, caring person? So Jesus ends with, what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. The things that people normally think are fantastic and wonderful and praise, a lot of those times, those are things that God detests. I'll give you, I hesitate to give specific examples, lest I come across as making up those legal laws that if you have like this possession, there's no way you're saved and that. So I'm going to avoid that. But, sometimes go back to those images of darkness. Okay, there are movies that people highly love and highly praise and highly value that God, he looks at it and I'm sure he thinks, I hate that. I hate that. So that's just one example that comes to mind. All right, first, you've often heard it said, money is the root of all evil. Okay, money is the root of all evil. Well, technically, it's the love of money. All right. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 through 10. But godliness with contentment is great gain. It's like saying it's great wealth. Godliness with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. You got food, you got clothes, be happy, be thankful. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. You've got to... I know it's easy to want to be rich, okay? But there are traps there. There are dangers there. Big dangers. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Paul said there's many who they've wandered from the faith, they've gone after wealth, they've gone after riches, and it's ended up in a whole bunch of grief for them. Again, this is 1 Timothy 6 through 10. So that's what Jesus is saying. You're not going to be able to love God and love money. It's not going to work. Now, the best example of this, the classic example of this, is Judas. Okay, I'm sorry, I got distracted by the timer, um, on my video here. So anyway, I'm going to have to splice the two videos together. I just realized that. But hey, that'll teach me a new trick. Old dog. All right, the best example, the most notorious person in all the Bible, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus for money. They gave him 30. They agreed to give him 30 pieces of silver. Now there is a little bit of story behind that. In fact, a very powerful story that illustrates this point that we can't serve two masters. We especially cannot serve God and wealth, because Judas was trying to do it. John chapter 12, verse 1 through 6. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was meant that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. So Mary, one of Jesus' dear friends, she had a sister named Martha, a brother named Lazarus. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead after he'd been dead for 4 days. It happens in the previous chapter, John chapter 11. So Mary comes, puts this precious, expensive perfume on Jesus' feet because it's getting close to the time of his death. And so God moved her heart to do that. Now, one apostle, one of Jesus' 12 special followers, special messengers, objected. Judas, who was going to betray him. And the reason he objected, he feigned like he cared about the poor, but he, as it said here, he kept the money for the group. So when anyone would donate money to Jesus and his followers so they could eat or whatever, they'd give the money to Judas. Judas would keep it in the bag, but sometimes Judas, took money from the treasury, shall we say. So Jesus rebukes Judas and praises Mary for what she has done. Now keep that in mind, and let's look. You can either look at Matthew 26, 6 through 16 or Mark 14, 3 through 11. We're going to look at Mark 14. Okay, Mark 14, verse 3 through 11. But either story will do because they tell the same story and the same instant thereafter. So again, we have this story about the anointing. Mark 14, verse 3 to 11. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. Now we know, thanks to John, that it was Mary. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. So it was more than just Judas, objecting to this, but because of the story, the way, the details John gives us, we know that Judas was among them, and Jesus rebuked Judas. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." And we are fulfilling that prophecy of Jesus this very moment. We're telling her story, just like Jesus said we would. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. it is no coincidence that right after Jesus rebukes Judas, who was upset because this expensive perfume could have been sold, put in his money bag, and he'd take some of that money. He was so hacked off at having lost this opportunity to get money, being rebuked by Jesus, that he turns around and goes to the Pharisees, goes to, I'm trying to remember who he said he went to here, to the chief priest, goes to the chief priest in order to betray Jesus to get money. You can't serve God and wealth. Now, do we need to be able to use wealth? Absolutely. We need to be wise with it. Wealth can do so much good for so many people. Yes, we should be wise with money. Don't hear me saying that I'm saying not be wise. I've not been wise with money. It's been a curse for decades. Okay? We need to be wise with money. I didn't understand that before. But never love money. Never trust money. Money can't hear your prayers. Money doesn't care about you. Money can't hate. Money can't love. Money comes, money goes. Okay? It's an inanimate thing. It's not going to love you back. It's not going to serve you back. So never love money, never trust money, but use it to do good. Use it to do good and be wise with it. Okay, that's all we can cover for today. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been helpful. God bless you. And again, thank you for listening. I'm honored you take time to do this. God bless you.